The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you out on the West Coast. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today for our course rating webinar on the remaining 5 obstacle factors in course rating. My name is John Suazo. You will hear from both Matt Duffy and Scott Hovde from the USGA Handicapping and Course Rating Department today as well. And this is the final webinar in the series of 3 USGA webinars designed to help new course raters. First off, as always, I'd just like to confirm that everyone out in the audience could both hear my voice and see our screen displayed here. If you'd be able to leave us a quick confirmation in the questions tab, that'd be much appreciated. Okay, perfect. We're getting some affirmative there. So as I've mentioned on these previous webinars, if you have any generic course rating questions outside of the scope of what we're covering today, please feel free to contact us outside of this webinar, either directly or at crdbquestions@usga.org. We will have breaks for questions today between each section, each obstacle factor. So please feel free to submit any questions you may have on that specific obstacle factor in the questions tab of GoToWebinar. We are going to address as many as possible in our question breaks. And if we have time at the end of the webinar today, we will address some additional questions there as well. Please note we do have a very large virtual audience today, and we will do our best to address as many questions as possible. If we are unable to get to all of them, we will also provide written responses to these questions in the form of a Q&A document emailed to all of you in the days following this webinar. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Matt Duffy, who will get us started today, and thank you again for joining us.
Alrighty, thanks, John, and I echo John's sentiments for thanking you all who have participated in 1 or 2 or all 3 now of these sessions. We appreciate your time and your volunteering at your golf association. So you can see our agenda that we have here that's been on the screen here for a minute or two. The first topic that we're going to tackle today is crossing obstacles. We're going to go into what is a crossing obstacle and what defines sort of a crossing obstacle as we move throughout this section. So what is a crossing obstacle? Crossing obstacles consist of penalty areas, extreme rough, including desert, and out of bounds, which are carried to play the hole. Multiple crossings on a hole are evaluated separately for each shot. So crossings, if there's multiple creeks, multiple extreme rough, etc., the player must cross in order to navigate the hole to get to the final destination, which is the green. We will look at those independently and see which of the 2 values are higher. Some notes that are based on crossing obstacles. The ratings are based on the length of the shot required to safely carry that obstacle. What does that word safely carry mean? Is at least 10 yards beyond the margin of the crossing obstacle. We're not going to take the distance that it takes to cross the obstacle just at the line of the margin once the obstacle has been crossed. Why is that? The ball hits there and bounces back. It's a lot of times that will occur because there may be an upslope or whatever. So we want to go at least 10 yards beyond the margin of the obstacle so that the player safely carries it, most likely will not roll back into that penalty area, that extreme rough, etc. Short carries over obstacles can result in a 0 crossing obstacle value, and we'll show that on the upcoming slides here with the table. Right? When a crossing obstacle only exists, there's no table value, which I said on the subsequent slides here. You'll see the table values. There is no lateral obstacle table rating value. A value of 1 is recorded under the lateral obstacle to satisfy this existing concept, right? We look at crossing and lateral obstacles are looked at holistically. Obstacles is almost a category, and what consists of those obstacles are out of bounds, extreme rough, and penalty areas. Extreme rough, by definition, is full season grass in excess of 6 inches for men or 5 inches for women in length, For warm season, it's 4 inches for men, 3 inches for women. And that can include, underbrush, sand dunes, rocks, heather, gorse, etc. There's a bunch of conditions that can pertain to extreme rough, which are noted in the guide. Those are just some examples that I mentioned. The picture there on the bottom right corner, displays, a tee shot that must carry extreme rough there. Certainly it's patchy in areas and it's very rocky, in those areas that you don't see any greenery or shrubbery, if you will. So certainly if a player must play from that, it's not going to be fun to recover from. So we'll take a look now at what the crossing table and adjustments look like, right? Notice that the table doesn't start at 0 for either men or women scratch or bogey players. Each gender scratch and bogey length values are on the left side, and the bogey length ranges and values are on the right. So now that you see 3 adjustments there, the carry adjustments, if a crossing obstacle closely borders the front of the green. A couple of things there. Closely bordering, by definition, is 10 yards less is front of the green. You can apply that C adjustment. You'll notice there's no caveats of 5 or more like you have for green targets or anything like that you see in other adjustments for like bunkers. So just wanted to make mention of that. Now the question we often get as to why is it carry only applied to that crossing in front of the green as opposed to anywhere else on the golf course is there's a premium put on accuracy when you're hitting to the green as opposed to hitting a tee shot, for example. When you're hitting a tee shot, you're trying to maximize your distance. The accuracy portion, there's a little less premium on that. When you're hitting to a green and you've got that crossing, when you have a short pitch or you have a long pitch or a short iron in your hand, certainly there's a premium on accuracy to get as close to the flag as possible. And so that's why, that premium of the crossing obstacle closely bordering the front of the green would get that +1 for scratch or bogey. This is the first time we also see the P adjustment, the percentage adjustment. So a crossing obstacle is narrow or partial, and it can be played from some of the time, considered using the percentage adjustment. Really this adjustment is probably most commonly used throughout the rating process in this section for both crossing and lateral. This helps basically fine-tune in assessing each crossing obstacle. Whether it's a pond with deep water or by creek or the extreme rough isn't as thick and lush. There's nuance within each golf course as to how they determine their penalty areas and extreme rough and the sun. That's where these nuances and you, newer raters, leaning on your captains, can help answer those questions as to when applying a percentage adjustment to that table value is necessary. And then we also have a 2 adjustment with a long explanation, not as common as the other two above as well. Now you notice that if, going back to the C adjustment, if you have a 0 table value, meaning you have a short pitch, you can apply a 0 and add +1 if there's a carry adjustment there. So just wanted to make note of that as well. If you have that short pitch over a penalty area that's closely bordering the front of the green, for example, you can apply it to a 0 table value to get that up to a 1. So if we take a look at our first crossing example, this hole may look familiar. The 17th hole at Sawgrass that Kevin Na is hitting into right now. We've got our table value there on the right for both players. The men are in blue, women are in yellow table. Scratch left side. Bogey values are on the right side. So in this example, we've got a 127-yard hole for men, 110 yards total for women. The carry safely distance is 109 yards for men, 82 yards for women. The penalty area water closely borders the front of the green. So let's take a look at how we're going to apply this for the crossing obstacle. We know our distances, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at that, and we're going to put those into our form that you see there at the bottom of your screen. That form shows that the 109 is for one's embraces are 82 for women. So if we take a look at our scratch values here, straight off the table, right? We go to 109 yards for men and 182 yards for women for scratch. You'll see that at 109, it's a value of 1 for each player. So we have a value of 1 for each player based on that. That's the top row for both scratch men's and women's players that you see there. Because we only have the distance of 109. We're not looking at the 127 or 110. We're looking at the 109 and 82 to carry safely. That's that 10 yards beyond the margin of the penalty area in this instance. The bogey player, we're going to do the same. They have the same distances. We're all starting at the same point here on the same hole. So we have 109 and 82 for bogey men and women respectively. So at 109, we're looking at that third row for men and women. We both get a 4 for each player for 109 yards for the bogey male, and we get 2 as well for the bogey women's player, right? But we also have this caveat at the bottom of our first example, which is the penalty area water closely borders the front of that green. So with that, you know, C+1 adjustment, right? Within that 10-yard margin that I talked about from the front of the green. So that scratch value that was a 1 for both players, for both men and women, becomes a 2, right? 1 plus that carry adjustment equals 2. We're going to do the same process for bogey men and women. We're in that third row on the crossing obstacle table. 109 yards and 82 yards is a 4. This C adjustment is applied to both those players. So that 4, we're going to add 1, becomes a 5. So this would be our final values for this hole for both the scratch and bogey players would be 2 and 5 after the carry adjustment is applied because of that penalty area water closely bordering the front of the green. Let's take a look at a second example here. Got our table values over there on the right side of your screen. We've got the course rating form there. And then we've got the hole information. It's a par 4 hole. We've got 176 yards for men, 151 for women, yard crossing to safely carry over the extreme rough scratch for the scratch player. The bogey player has 103 yards for men, 73 yard crossing to carry safely over that extreme rough. The rating team determines that if a ball is hit in the extreme rough, any player can find and play from that extreme rough 50% of the time. So even though the ball may end up in that rough, the player should be able to find it half the time and then obviously continue on to play for the remainder of the hole and hit it out and advance the ball. So based on that crossing, we put in our form 1 left side scratch, right side bogey, 176 for men scratch, 151 scratch women, 103 men for bogey, 73 for women's bogey crossing to safely carry. If we're looking at the table values straight off the table, 176 and 151 for the scratch players, both of them, you'll see is in that 4th row for both players, and that equals a 4, right? So right off the bat, our table value is a 4 for both players. For our bogey players at 103 and 73, men and women respectively, we're going to go to that 3rd row for both players, and that's also a 4. So both players' table values are at 4 as of now. we also have that third bullet that you see there on your screen, that the rating team determines that if a ball is hit in that extreme rough, any player can find and play from it 50% of the time. So what does that percentage adjustment do? We're going to take half that table value, and that's going to be our only final adjustment there. So those 4s become 2s for both players, right? So we took half of what the table value was there and applied it for the adjustment and off the table, and that's how we get our 2s. Now, a very common question is, well, Matt, what if we get an odd number from the table? You know, typically, you know, in general, most times, you know, normal rounding procedures takes place if you have a 5 or a 3, for example, for any of the players, and you cut it in half. In this example, was 1.5 or 2.5, respectively. So typically, you round up to make those 2s and 4s, but that's certainly up to your rating team. Sometimes, you know, if you've rounded up several times, and your rating captain may look to temper some of those values down and round down. So certainly part of that toggling procedure you may see used during the course of a rating process, but you know, typically we tend to round up when we get those half values. So those 2.5s, 3.5s, etc., would be 3 and 4 respectively if you get an odd number from the based off of the percentage adjustment going down. So with that, John, do we have any questions after our first section?
Yeah, Matt, 2 questions right now. First off, for a dogleg hole where a player might try to cut the corner, do you rate a crossing obstacle that only has to be carried if the player cuts the corner? For example, if this hole was played as it was measured, the obstacle would be lateral, not crossing.
No, sure. That's a great question. So if the player is, you know, decided that, you know, obviously taking that dog leg, whether, you know, cutting the corner for that scratch player, if they then, you know, sort of change that line of play, then certainly that, you know, would normally be lateral, I guess you would, as you described it, John, would be a crossing and then applying any percentage adjustments based on, you know, where and what that crossing.
Great. And one other question here. For the first example with water at the green, would you also give a lateral value there or just a crossing value?
Sure, there would be, you know, certainly laterals, and there's other potential adjustments there with under lateral as well. This, we were just looking at the crossing value in this example. So just wanted to go over one at a time for this. So certainly there would be lateral numbers, as we're all very, I'm sure most of us, if not all, very familiar with this whole seeing on TV for a number of years, that there would be lateral values, but only looking at it from a crossing standpoint, just to talk about this section. Any other questions, John?
No, that's all for now, Matt.
Okay, sounds good. Now we'll jump into lateral obstacles. All right, lateral obstacles. Some of this information may sound very familiar just because it consists of the same thing. So lateral obstacles consists of penalty areas, extreme rough, and out of bounds when they all come into play laterally on a hole. Some of the notes that we take a look at when we're discussing lateral obstacles. Lateral obstacle ratings are based on shot length required to reach the landing zone, whether that's fairway or green, and the distance of the lateral obstacle from the center of that landing zone, so fairway and green. We're looking at the location and the size and the conditions in that lateral obstacle. The conditions in that area adjacent to that obstacle, as well as the number of times that lateral obstacle comes into play. Once again, we're looking at crossing and lateral as almost holistically, whereas the obstacles are consistent of out of bounds, extreme rough, and penalty areas. And once again, I want to reiterate that extreme rough is cool season grass in excess of 6 inches for men, 5 inches for women in length. And then in warm season grass, it's 4 inches and 3 inches for men and women respectively. And once again, some of those conditions are, palmettos, ice plant, heather, gorse, etc., that will likely make the ball be lost, or it would be very difficult to advance the ball to the next landing zone or green if you do end up in there. We have to account within lateral obstacles what is laterally left of the center of the fairway landing zone and right to determine which of these two creates that higher value, that higher table value plus adjustments. So certainly as we move through this section, I have an example here where we're through, looking at the left side and seeing what we have to take into account. On the right there, you see the famous hole that you've probably seen on TV many times is Pebble Beach, 17 hole there. Certainly there's a lot going on there. Got a big body of water, and obviously the on the left side playing the hole, and on the right side you've got the out of bounds with all those homes that you see there on the right hand side. So let's take a look at the lateral tables and adjustments. Obviously you have a lot more adjustments here that you see on your screen than we did for the crossing. We'll certainly go over some. On the lateral table that you see there for men and women, it's the shot length to the target. So you see a complete list there. That bottom row certainly is, we're talking about full tee shots in most cases, and then the subsequent shots from there. And obviously shorter shots, we have lesser values from that top row to the distance to that penalty area or out of bounds extreme rough from the center of the green. So certainly we're looking at multiple things here, looking at shot length to the landing zone or center of the green, and then from there, where's the proximity of that penalty area, out of bounds, etc., from that final destination, the fairway landing zone or the center of the green. Once again, the men's values are on the left, men's values are in the blue table, women's in yellow. The scratch players going to enter the table from the left side, bogey on the right side. You'll notice on the top right there where it says adjustment and bogey ratings, apply in the order listed below. Certainly this is very important. I know Scott and I have touched on this topic in the previous sessions, but really important once we got to like bounce and decay, which I'll go over here momentarily, about applying adjustments in the order that they are listed, right? We'll certainly cover on the next couple of slides the S and the K adjustments, but the other adjustments that are frequently used are that bounce adjustment. So just reading that bounce, if conditions like a cart path or sloping ground increase the likelihood that a ball will bounce into that obstacle, do not use it at the distance from the center of the target landing zone is less than 15 yards. So certainly, as you can imagine, if there's a cart path near and out of bounds or a penalty area, there's a likelihood if you miss the fairway, that ball may strike that cart path and then create more distance and enter the penalty area or out of bounds, and certainly increases the likelihood the ball will bounce into it. So that's the thought process there. And those are just examples of a cart path or sloping ground. There could be other factors as well. There's also the caveat of do not use at the distance of the center of the target landing zone is less than 15 yards. Rationale behind that, ladies and gentlemen, is because you're getting such a high table value right off the bat that we don't want to increase that value or overinflate it. So certainly when we're talking about the less than 15 yards, you see that it can be as high as a 7 or as low as a 3. So certainly very high values in that table. You have a minus of bounce adjustment. So if conditions such as a tree or an obstacle decrease the likelihood that a ball will bounce or or fly into the obstacle, or the obstacle only comes into play behind the green, certainly that -1 bounce is available. Certainly, if you see a bunker near a penalty area, that player near a green or closely bordering green, I should say, certainly those balls may most likely fly into the bunker, and that bunker will, for example, prevent that ball from going into the water. A lot of times on the first or 10th tee, you may have a driving range on one side or the other of the hole, and there's a big net, and that net may stop balls from going onto the driving range and shoot them back into the general area. So certainly that minus bounce in that example of a big tall fence to keep the driving range golf ball separate from the regular play certainly can help there as well. And on down the list here, you see certainly the K adjustment there, which we'll go over in a little while, but just certainly only apply that if the table value plus adjustments are greater than 1. So the adjustment above it is obviously the bounce adjustment. Then we'll apply the K adjustment there, and that's treated as a lateral penalty area and a stroking distance penalty applies, which is OB or where the likelihood of a ball will be lost in extreme rough. And then do not use if the rating value is a 1. So we'll certainly get into that. We also see our percentage adjustment there, which is also very popular in this, and sort of describing that in the previous section, that not all penalty areas, not all extreme rough are created equal. Some of them may be drier creeks, some of them may be wispier, long grass, certainly 6-inch grass, but it's not as filled in as some others, so certainly maybe playable onto the next hole. And then you can see the other adjustments there. We'll certainly get into the S adjustment as well. And we'll actually do that right now. So read the adjustment right off the slide. If the green is closely surrounded, so closely within 10 yards of the surrounded by crossing and a lateral obstacle, the green target value must be 5 or greater for that scratch player, but any value for that bogey player. See the table to the right. In this example, I just blew it up so that we could all see it. It's right there at the top of the screen. So very much like under the depth adjustment in bunkers or the C adjustment in R&R, we have a adjustment table for the green surround. Certainly some coastal areas, you may see this a lot. And what this is, if the fraction of the green is surrounded by a penalty area, OB extreme rough, certainly that places a premium on hitting that green, and some of these will be applied. You can see the values there of 0 to plus. Then you'll notice the cross there of that +2, and you see the note there at the bottom of the table. It says also apply the surround adjustment under R&R. If we go back to that page or that slide I had up previously, you saw the 17th hole at Sawgrass. There it's surrounded by water. Certainly most likely you'd apply that 2 adjustment because it's completely surrounded by water. There's no real recovery from that. If your ball's in the water, it's tough luck. You'll have to either, there's a drop zone, or once again play it from where you last hit it, which is the teeing area. Then there's no recovery from that. You have to hit a full shot. So just wanted to make sure I noted that cross there that you see next to the +2 means that we're also going to apply a surround adjustment that's under R&R as well. So lateral adjustments. Again, let's jump into the K adjustments. Relatively new adjustment for those of you who may only been rating for a couple of years, right? We're going to apply this in the order listed is key, especially in this, as a caveat to using the K is by the time it gets to whether or not to use. It must be a 2 or more after our B adjustment is applied after the table value. So as you can see, if we have a full tee shot for any player and the out of bounds is 30 yards right from the center of the green, or center of the fairway, excuse me, of 33 yards. We'll use that number for both players. That becomes a 3, regardless if we have a bounce adjustment or not, plus or minus. We're going to apply that K because, you know, it's going to either be a 2 or a 4 or remain a. Certainly that would be an instance where the K adjustment would be applied, right? And if I read that again, if the area is not a penalty, lateral penalty area, and stroking distance applies, such as out of bounds or a ball be lost in extreme rough, we're not going to use it as a rating value if table value plus or minus the bounce adjustment. So if we have a short shot into a green, for example, where we're using somewhere in that top row, and we'll use that 33 yards again. Certainly, if we have a 1 and there's no bounce adjustment, we're not going to apply that K because, like I said, most likely that player will never reach that out of bounds. That's 33 yards right. So we don't want to, you know, overinflate these values as well. Once again, the K adjustment, you see that asterisk next to it, those indicated shot specific. So if we have and which you'll see in an example here momentarily, if we have out of bounds on one side, right, on the right side of a landing zone, but on the left side we have the penalty area, we're going to look at those sides independently of one another, and we're going to find our final value for the right side, that in this case out of bounds. If we should apply the K adjustments, right, we would only apply it on the right side because the left side is a penalty area. There's the drop rule that's in place where there's no stroke and distance penalty available. Once again, if the table value plus the B adjustment are greater than 1, apply that K adjustment if it applies, right? If it applies and meets that criteria. And one other note that I want to make, that, you know, sometimes in your pre-rating process, the captains may ask questions before the rating process happens, and one of them probably is whether or not they're using this new alternative stroke and distance local rule that went into effect in 2019 when the rules of golf were modernized with the R&A and the USGA went into effect. So you'll see that note is, regardless if that alternative stroke and distance local rule is in effect, you will still apply that K adjustment if it has met the criteria within the description, right? So that K, as long as it meets that description, is going to be applied whether that local rule is in effect for that golf course on days of play. So the reason and the rationale behind that is because whether you take that stroke and distance and hit your third shot, for example, off the tee, or place your ball in the nearest fairway, and I know I'm not using the, you know, verbatim out of the rules of golf, but I'm sort of using it in layman's terms. So regardless if you hit that third shot from the tee or place it in the nearest fairway, you know, after hitting the ball out of bounds, it is equally as punitive because you're hitting your third shot from the tee or the fourth shot from the fairway, and then obviously progressing on down the hole as that. So almost as equally as punitive either way. So regardless if that local rule is in effect or not, we're still going to apply that K adjustment for out of bounds. All right. So this hole should look familiar. I just blew it up from our original screen. The par 5 hole, the 3-shot hole for all players. This is our first caveat. This is going to be a long example, so only going to do one, but what we're going to do is going to go through this process step by step. So we've got our men's and women's tables there in the upper left-hand corner. And then in the lower left, we've got a rating form for all of our players. So what we're going to do, though, is we're going to just go over only the scratch values there that you see sort of middle center of your screen there. Then we'll cover the bogey golfer, the bogey player secondary, just so that we can look at it separately, so that we're not, getting too confused going back and forth. There's going to be a lot to certainly talk about, and if you have a pen or paper or a pencil and paper near you, certainly looking at each landing zone independently, it may help you as we progress forward through this process. So let's take a look at the first scratch landing zone. we've got a penalty area that you can see left that has absolutely no recovery. Certainly if you end up in that penalty area there, you're in the water and there's no chance of you playing from there. You're going to take that drop. On the left side, on the right side, we've got OB 28 yards right with a cart path 5 yards inside that OB stake. So on our rating form for for the scratch player, we're going to put 26 and 28 left and right. That's how I like to do it on a rating form. Certainly there may be other ways that you want to do it, but that's how I will differentiate left side, right side is the 26 and 28. So that first landing zone, right, if we just take a look at the left side, right, we've got 26 yards left to that penalty off a full tee shot for both scratch players. So if we go to our table there in the upper left corner, we go down to that bottom row, and we go to a column that 26 yards fit in, which is in the middle 20 to 29. We get a 5, right? So once again, bottom row, full tee shot for both players, and then 20 to 29 because we have 26 yards. That is a 5. So we know that that left side is going to be a 5. So we're looking at these independently, both sides. On the right side, we've got OB 26 yards right with a cart path 5 yards inside that OB stake. Right? So we're going to do the same process again. We're going to do that same process again. Full tee shot, 230 yards or greater than 230, 190 for men and women. We've got an OB stakes, we got a cart path 5 yards within that OB stake and 28 yards. So we go down to that middle column again because that's where 20 to 29 fits. We get a 5. We've got a bounce adjustment there, right? Because we got that cart path really close to that out of bounds. The ball will bounce and end up in someone's backyard out of bounds, right? So that 5 will then become a 6. And then we also have that K, that stroke and distance penalty. Regardless of that ball, if that local rule is in effect, we're going to apply that K adjustment, right? Because after bounce, we've got a 2 or more based on the caveats that are within that K adjustment. So now that 5 table value becomes a 6 after the bounce, and then a 7 after the K. So the right side, you get a 7 after the bounce and K adjustment. The K adjustment doesn't apply to the left side, as that's a PA. So right now, based off our first landing zone for scratch, we've got a 5 on the left, we've got a 7 on the right. We already know that a 7 is more than 5. So as we move ahead to the next landing zone, we're going to keep that in mind and certainly write that in pencil to know that our first landing zone, we've got a 7. So certainly keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward. As we move to the next landing zone for scratch, we've got a penalty area, 10 yards left, no recovery. It's that same water that you see there. And OB, we've got 32 yards right with a cart 5 yards inside the OB stake, just like in the previous. So once again, we're going to write 31, 32 there. That's how I like to do it, left, right, just so that I can differentiate the two, right? So that penalty area on that left side is 31 yards left. We're going to go a row up on our table, right? So for 210 to 230 for men, 175 to 190 for women. That's how far those players hit their second full shots, right? We're going to go to find 31 table, and that's that second column there, the 30 to 39. And those values are 3, right? That value is a 3, right? We also have, you can also notice there in that second landing zone, there's that fairway bunker that really extends almost the final third of that hole, maybe third or a quarter of that hole. And we're certainly within that, in that distance there. So on the left side, we've got that 3 off the table based on that 31 yards left, right? That 3 becomes a 2 because we've got a minus B. That bunker is going to, certainly catch a lot of those errant second shots for our scratch players. and be able to swallow them up and keep them in the bunker as opposed to going into the water. Now we're going to look at the right-hand side. Certainly, we're going to look, we've got that same distance there, that second row from the bottom for both men and women, the 210 to 230, 175 to 190. And we've got a out-of-bounds stakes, 32 yards right with that cart path still, right? So once again, we're going to do the same process for the right side. That 210 to 230, 175 to 190. We're going to go to that second column because we're at 32 yards right. And you'll see that we get threes. We get threes. Now we also have that bounce adjustments that we also talked about in our previous example in the first landing zone. We've got our K adjustment that we have to apply because we're going to get a value that's greater than 1. So after the B and the K, we're adding 2 points to our table value, which is a 3. We get a 5, right? We get a 5, right? So left side was a 2, right side is a 5. Certainly the 5 matters, right? But if you remember from our previous landing zone, that right side still has that 7. So that 7 is still trumping the second landing zone. So now we still have to remember that we have that 7 from that original landing zone number 1. And we're going to move forward. So just remember to keep that in the back of your minds. We're then going to work forward to the green. The green, we've got a 55-yard shot for men, 35-yard approach shot for women. You've got a penalty area left. However, that bunker stops most shots from entering the penalty area. So that should trigger most of you about that bunker entering the penalty area there on the left side there that you can see on your screen. So you can see at the green, we're going to put 22 yards, right? Because that 22 yards is laterally left. If you'd like to put it, L there, that's certainly, okay. There's just however you want to note that. I just put the 22 there in our example. We talked about at the green, right? That penalty area, which is that same water, comes into effect laterally left at 22 yards. So if we look at the shots into the green, we've got 55 and 35 respectively for men and women. You'll notice that we're in that top row for both scratch players, men and women. We know that it's 22 yards left, so we're going to find that column that's appropriate. So that 20 to 29 column, which is where we get that 2, right? So there we have a 2 there. Now we notice we talked about in that bunker is going to stop most shots from entering that penalty area. So that 2 then becomes a 1, right? So at the green, our value is a 1. So as we move forward, we've got all of our numbers listed here. We've got our landing zone number 1, landing zone number 2 for scratch, and then at the green, right? Our highest values came from that landing zone number 1, the right side, right? That full tee shot, at 28 yards right with that bunker and the K adjustment brought it to a 7. So our final lateral value there after all the adjustments, all the accounting, if you will, is a 7. So that's our final value, right? Just want to show you the example where we're looking left and right for all these situations here for players. Now let's take a look at the bogey player, right? We'll go through this process again, right? Each landing zone step by step. So in the bogey's first landing zone, we've got a penalty area, 23 yards left, no recovery. We've got out of bounds 33 yards right with a cart path 5 yards inside the OB stake, right? So that same OB that we talked about earlier. So we're going to put that information right there in our rating form on the right side. Like I said, that's how I like to do it, 23 and 33, respectively. For bogey's first landing zone, the left side, based on the information provided, is a 5 right off the table, and there's no adjustments. There's no out of bounds, bounces, there's no issues like that. I can use a bounce or a K in any of those instances. The right side is off the table, right? So full tee shots for the bogey player, that bottom row. We've got 33 yards to that out of bounds stake. And then we also have a cart path within that, just right inside of that OB stake. So we're going to add a point there. So that 33 off the table, off a full tee shot, at 33 yards is a 3. We're going to add the bounce adjustment because of that cart path. We're going to add the K because of that stroke and distance penalty. Becomes a 5, right? So we have 2 5s right now starting. The left side, we get it from that penalty area. That's 23 yards is a 5 off the table, no adjustments. And then we also get a 5 on the right side in this instance for the bogey player, right? So right now we know our highest value. Moving forward to the next landing zone and fairway and green, we've got a 5 to work with. So certainly keep that written in pencil if you have scratch paper next to you. Let's go to our second landing zone. The bogey player on the left side has a penalty area 28 yards left, no recovery. And then we also have OB 42 yards right with a cart path 5 yards inside the OB stake, as we did in the previous example. So once again, just like the scratch player, when we go to landing zone number 2, we're not looking at that bottom row. We're not hitting full tee shots. Only capable as bogey players. The second from the bottom row is where we're going to sit because they're not hitting full tee shots or can't hit the ball further than 180 or 130, respectively. Right, so we're going to go to that second from the bottom. We've got 28 yards left, so off the table. And the 160 to 180 or 115 to 130 into a 28 is a 4 off the table. You've got that same bunker in that second landing zone that stretches the final third or the final quarter of that hole. That's going to catch most of those shots that are errant. So that minus B is appropriate there. So that 4 from the left side becomes a 3. We also have the out of bounds stake that's on the right side, and that's 42 yards right with a cart path 5 yards inside the stake. So once again, we're going to go to that second from the bottom row because we can't hit a shot more than 180 yards for men or 130 for women. And we've got 42 yards, so we're going to go all the way to the left. And you'll see that that value is a 2. We've got a bounce adjustment because of that same cart path. And we've got a K adjustment because of the out of bounds that's listed there. Right? So that 2 off the table plus the bounce plus the K is a 4. So on the left side, after our table value and adjustments, right, we have a 2. And on the right side, after table value and adjustments, we have a 4. But if you remember, from that first landing zone, both sides got that 5 there. So we have to know that 5 trumps that 4 in that second landing zone on the right side, right? So just know that we're still holding strong with that first landing zone with those 5s. At the green, we have an approach shot of 105 yards or 80 yards for women. The penalty area, that same penalty area, is still 22 yards left. However, that bunker stops most shots from entering the penalty area. So at the green, we have 22 yards listed there. We have 22 yards listed there. You see that same 22 is at the green, just like the scratch player. For a 105-yard shot for men and 80 yards for women, we're going to look at that third row for both players. We're going to look at the third row for both players. So at that value of 105 or 80 yards for women, into a 22 is a 3. You can see that from just going into that middle column there, the 20 to 29 column there is a 3. We also have that bunker that's going to stop most shots from entering that penalty area. And so the player can obviously mishit it a little bit and it'll still enter in that bunker and keep it from entering the penalty area. So we're going to apply that bounce adjustment to that table value. So we'll get a 2 there based on our information at the green. So based on all that information, I know that was a mouthful going through and certainly a newer rater, certainly leaning on your your captains will be very helpful in taking a look at two sides with multiple landing zones. We still get our final value from that first landing zone when we had 2 5s on both the left side and right side. So our final lateral values for this hole would be 7 for scratch and 5 for bogey. So like I said, I know it's a mouthful, and but it's obviously important to make sure that, when we're looking at these adjustments, we're looking at only on one side or another, depending on the situation. In this instance, we had out of bounds on the right. We didn't have out of bounds on the left, so that K adjustments didn't apply because it was a penalty area the entire way down the hole in our instance. So with that, John, are there any questions?
Yeah, it looks like Scott's answered a couple while you were going there, Matt, but we did have this question come in a couple of times while you were going over the bogey example.
Yeah.
Is there a 2 adjustment for the player because the lateral obstacles comes into play twice with each value greater than 5? We had that question come in a couple of times from different people, but that's essentially the same question from everyone.
Right, that's on subsequent landing zones. So we never got to a 5 in landing zone 2 or 3 or the green. So we had the 5s there on obviously on the right on that first landing zone, but that's in multiple locations and further landing zones. So. So yeah, so the landing zone 2 had had 5s or greater, and it added up, and that 2 adjustment would certainly be appropriate, but it wasn't in this instance.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Yeah, the rest of the questions, I believe Scott got to those during the example there.
Certainly, and certainly yes, and I know, like I said, that one is a mouthful, and that section is a mouthful for sure. But just wanted to certainly go over that one example there shortly, slowly but surely, and I know that was a mouthful, moving forward. So wanted to make sure I took my time on that process there. So with that, I will pass the mouse and keyboard to Scott here momentarily. I will do that now. And Scott, we'll take you home the rest of the way. So Scott, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Matt. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. I know a couple questions maybe popped in after Matt was done talking and transitioning to myself, so we'll definitely get to those at the end of the session when we have time here. So I'm going to go ahead and take you through the rest of the obstacles, which there's 3 more, but thankfully these are a lot less intensive than the crossing and lateral obstacles that Matt just covered. Trees is going to be the first one I'm going to go over here. And before I even get started, trees are definitely probably the most subjective obstacle out there because we don't have a table that allows you to measure and get a precise number off of a table. It's a little bit of a judgment call. So as I move forward here, trying to get my mouse to work. There we go. Trees must be rated by evaluating the overall impact of trees on the play of the hole. So we're looking at the trees on the entire hole to come up with a value. We're not doing it on a shot-by-shot basis like we did for, lateral obstacles or fairway or other obstacles like that. So once the entire hole has been evaluated for trees, a value must be assigned based on whether the trees are a minor, moderate, significant, or extreme problem. So there's basically 4 categories of tree ratings or tree evaluation. There's really a 5th category, if you want to call it that, which is a 0, which means trees don't exist. So how we rate trees, essentially look at the length of the hole, which is really just broken down whether it's a 1-shot hole or a 2 or more shot hole. A 1-shot hole being defined as a par 3. So if a player hits a single shot and is able to reach the green, we're going to use the 1-shot hole row of the table. If it's 2 or more shots, which could either be a par 4 or par 5, but could be a par 3 hole for the bogey golfer if they can't reach it in one shot. We use the second row of the table, and then the difficulty factor are those descriptions I described just above in the sentence above. So trees are generally less of a factor on a one-shot hole. So you'll notice when I put the table up that the tree values on a one-shot hole are less because obviously on a par 3 hole, the player doesn't really deal with the trees until they get to the green on a par 3 hole, and other than an overhanging or an obstructing tree. But on a par 4 or par 5 hole where they're hitting multiple shots, they may have to hit their shots from the trees and quite a distance to get to the next landing zone or the green. All right, so putting up the table here, my mouse would cooperate with me here. Here we go. So as you can see, it's probably the smallest table, the smallest obstacle table in the system. Like I mentioned, there's no measurements here. There's no 90 to 129 yards or anything like that. It's just as simple as a one-shot hole or a 2 or more shot hole on the left. And then on the right, those columns on the right are just based on minor, moderate, significant, or extreme problems with trees. As it says at the bottom, all values may be adjusted by plus or minus 1 point. Really doesn't factor into the top row because they only go up by 1 point per movement. But for the second row, for the 2 or more shot hole, there are tweeners available. So as you can see, it goes from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8. So those values that sit between, so the 3, the 5, and the 7, are all available to use for trees as well. It's not uncommon to have trees that are between categories. So you may have trees that are between a minor and a moderate problem, and that's where we would use the 3 if it was a par 4 or par 5 hole, or between moderate to significant. So just because the table doesn't have the number listed, again, doesn't mean you can't use it. So the difficulty factor can be different for scratch and bogey. However, we base the recoverability or the ability to recover on a scratch player's ability. We're trying to keep it consistent, knowing that a bogey golfer may have trouble with a tree that's not really in the way. We want to make it consistent where we would say, how would a scratch golfer recover from this area from the trees? However, when I say there could be a different factor for scratch and bogey, is that they're going to be in different parts of the hole, and they're going to be different tree situations. So you might have a much heavier area of trees for the bogey golfer than there is for the scratch golfer. So obviously you can give the bogey golfer a higher rating off the table. But again, we're not trying to estimate the recoverability of a bogey golfer, as again, they can have trouble with trees even on a simple shot. So there's our scratch golfer hitting through the trees. And we do, again, use a scratch golfer only. And the reason is, one, it's easier to visualize how a scratch golfer can recover, or a scratch player can recover from the trees, ensuring that there's more consistency there. But second is that the bogey player receives a higher weighting factor for trees. So even if the value is the same for scratch and bogey, if let's say the value for trees is a 4 for scratch and a 4 for bogey, that 4 for bogey is going to get a higher weighting in the final calculations because the weighting factors are higher. So don't worry that your bogey golfer is getting a similar, or in some cases even lower tree rating than the scratch. Often it will be offset by the weightings in the formulas. So the difficulty factors is a number of things that we take into consideration. Like I said, the table is really simple. You're just determining whether it's minor, moderate, significant, or extreme. But how do we determine those categories? So we're going to look at a number of factors that a team should evaluate when determining what that final that rating is. So the number, height, and density of trees at each landing zone and on the line of play to the next target. Again, these are all things just to consider. It doesn't, no one of these drives the final tree rating. It's kind of a combination of all of them. One thing you'll note there in the parentheses is that it says at mid-season. If we didn't mention it in previous seminars, we do rate courses based on mid-season conditions, normal conditions in mid-season. So if you're rating a course in let's say the northern US in April, before the trees are full of leaves, you want to envision those trees having leaves and being a little bit more dense and harder to get through than if they're just tree branches and some, very wispy leaves at best. So do base it on mid-season conditions. Also, the length of the shot to the target landing zone or the green. The longer the shot is, the more trees could come into play because the player has to hit, their full distance or most of their distance. When a player has a short shot, they can actually have multiple options. They can keep the ball low, they can hit the ball high. You know, if you have to go over a tree that's, you know, 15 or 20 yards in front of you, but it's only a 100-yard shot to the green, a lot of players can go right up over it. But if that's a 200-yard shot to the green, let's say, for a scratch golfer, now they're hitting a long iron, maybe a wood, they don't have the same ability to get over that tree sometimes. So as it says, trees on a full shot are more likely to come into play than when a player lays up or hits less than a full shot. Other difficulty factors to consider, the distance of the trees from the center of the landing zone. Like I said, we don't measure to trees, but we do take note of how close those trees are to the center of the landing zone. So as you can see in this image, the fairway's fairly wide. It's probably 25, 30 yards wide, maybe more. And those trees are 5-6 yards off both sides of the fairway. So just, you know, keep it in mind of, you know, if those trees were another 10 yards, you know, off the fairway on both sides, that's going to lead to a much lower tree rating than it would be if those trees are where they are or even closer. So, and as it says here, are trees likely to come into play even on good shots? You know, if that player winds up in the left side of the fairway, those trees actually may come into play even on a shot that wound up in the fairway. So that's an indication that that tree rating should be maybe more than a minor issue. And as it says, do the trees closely border a narrow fairway landing zone? A narrow fairway with trees closely bordering it will definitely lead to high values. And then the length of shot required to reach the next landing zone or the green. And I think I mentioned this earlier. Is it a long iron or a wood or a short iron? As shots get shorter, the player has more options. They can keep the ball low, they can hit the ball high, they can punch it. Trees become less of an issue on shorter shots than they typically do on longer shots. And then the other thing, when getting into those trees, the presence of low-hanging branches. This is something that definitely will impact swing and obstruct recovery shots. So if this is a hole where the green is kind of, you know, in front of you in terms of the picture, out where the players on the card are, the player has to hit the ball very low to try to get out of these trees, and they probably aren't able to get the full distance out of that shot unless they have a really low stinger type shot where they can hit it, you know, 150 yards, no more than 4 feet off the ground. Obviously, that's not normal. So low-hanging branches not only restrict the ball flight, but also can restrict the swing itself. So if a player has to, you know, deal with branches that are hanging down and impacting the swing, that's going to reduce the ability to recover. And then also conditions under the trees that impact the lie of the ball. It's not just the trees themselves which cause the problem. Sometimes it's what's underneath the trees. Some courses are really good about keeping, you know, nice mown rough below the trees, but others kind of let it go a little wild. Maybe there's some tree roots, maybe there's some wood chips, you know, maybe it's just, you know, dirt and pine straw. There's a lot of different things that can be underneath the trees, and that will definitely impact the ability for a player to recover. So if they leave it a little bit more, you know, unmaintained, where it's, you know, it's a little bit more wild, there's a lot of, you know, maybe some foliage underneath the trees, it's obviously going to create more recovery issues. And the last few factors that you want to look at are the proximity of the trees to the ball when in flight. Trees are really a vertical obstacle more than a horizontal or a lateral obstacle. The ball is going to hit the tree in the air typically, and sometimes will restrict or reduce the distance the ball goes. So trees that really impact the flight of the ball are more of an issue than ones that the ball winds up in after it's done rolling. And then also conditions along the line of play from the trees that limit the shot options. So in this particular example, you can see there's a creek, a small creek that kind of runs in front of the green and kind of around the hole. If the player is on those trees or in the trees to the right side of the hole, on this image at least, they don't have the option of running the ball up to the green. If they have to keep the ball low out of those trees and that water is there between them and the green, that may reduce their ability to recover as well. So all these things really have to be looked at, but in general, it's just an overall rating of the impact of trees on the whole. There are a few adjustments for trees. This one does have a measurement table that you can use to determine what the value is, but it's called the chute adjustment. So if a tee shot must be hit through a narrow chute of trees, the value can be anywhere from a +1 to a +4. This amount will depend on the width and the length of the chute. So the distance it is for the player's shot from where they're hitting it to get through that chute, and the narrow portion of that chute, how wide is it? In this case, it's 14 yards wide. It's 105 yards to get through it. That's going to determine our chute value. So in that particular case, the table value would be a +2. I'm not sure I have the chute table up here. I guess I don't. But yeah, there's a chute table that essentially, if you have your course rating guide, it's on the bottom right of page 35. The chute value gets higher, or the chute adjustment gets higher as the shot either gets longer or the width of the chute gets narrower. So it's pretty obvious. The other adjustment is an obstruct adjustment. As you can see in this particular example, if the player's on the right side of the fairway going at that green there, those trees overhang and really obstruct the player's ability to get to that green. They may be able to get to the green. They may have to hit a shot that's either shaped or high or very low. But any which way you look at it, the player has to change the way they play that shot because those trees obstruct. So it's a +1 adjustment on top of the table value that's determined for the overall impact of trees in the hole. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to factor in the obstruct adjustment to the overall rating of the hole. So in this particular case, a rating team might say, hey, these trees kind of obstruct the shot. Let's give it a higher rating. Let's give it a moderate rating, or maybe even a significant rating, and then apply a +1 on top of it. So that's kind of double dipping. You want to look at the overall impact of trees without the obstruct, and then apply that +1 at the end as an obstruct adjustment to come up with that final rating. And as it says at the bottom of this adjustment, do not apply if the trees that obstruct the shot have been used to determine a chute adjustment. So when I go back to that last slide, you couldn't use an obstruct adjustment on this particular hole if you've already used the chute adjustment. The chute and the obstruct are similar in that the ball might hit those trees going through it. We don't want to apply both adjustments if it's either a chute or an obstruct, unless it's two different trees. You could have an obstructing tree that's not part of the chute that could be an obstruct on a different part of the hole. And then I'm going to go through just one example, not going to be nearly as intense as what Matt went through with the lateral obstacles slide, but we have a hole that's 365 yards for the men, equivalent of 275 for the women, and we're going to go ahead and look at this hole. Now, obviously, there's no measurements needed to be done, but in general, you're looking at this hole and saying, well, those trees are, they're fairly close to the fairway. They're numerous. There's trees pretty much down the entire length of the hole, although they're cut pretty high. I mean, the branches are not very low to the ground. So let's go ahead and say that for the scratch golfer, this is a moderate problem with recovery. And that would be a pretty, satisfactory rating. It's not a minor problem, but it's not quite a significant problem either. So moderate looks like a good number. But for the bogey golfer, and this is where one of those difficulty factors comes into play, they're hitting almost their maximum shot to get to the green. So when they hit their tee shot, they're almost at their full distance they can reach in 2 shots on this hole. So they're going to have to hit a very long shot to the green from the trees, a wood in their hand. Scratch golfers hitting probably a low to mid iron at most. So the scratch golfer in this case can recover from those trees a little bit better. So we're going to go ahead and use a moderate to significant recovery problem for the bogey golfer due to the fact that they're having to hit much longer shot to the green relative to their normal distance they hit the ball on their second shot. So for the scratch golfer, that tree value would be a 4, and that's just based on our table value with a 2 or more shot hole, moderate problem. And then for the bogey golfer, I used a tweener value. So it's not quite a full significant problem, but it's more than a moderate. So between moderate and significant lies that tweener value of 5. So again, a pretty simple example. If there was an obstruct or a chute on this particular hole, you would apply those adjustments to these table values that we just determined. So, questions? John, did any questions pop up about trees?
Yeah, a couple questions here, Scott. We will get through a couple overlapped as well. How would you assess the difference between a +1 and a +2 obstruct adjustment?
Well, there isn't a +2 obstruct adjustment available under trees. If we go backwards to the green target, which we talked about in our last session, there is an obstruct adjustment under, actually it's just a +1 as well. We did make that change. So there actually isn't a +2 adjustment for obstruct anymore. It's just a +1 maximum adjustment. So, but it is shot specific. So if you had multiple shots where there was an obstructing tree, so if you're on a hole where, you know, par 5 or a very long hole where the player's hitting 3 or, you know, maybe 4 shots to get to the green, they could have multiple obstruct values and add up to +2 or more. But there is no +2 obstruct as a singular adjustment.
Great. And for par 4 and par 5 holes, is the minimum rating for trees a 2?
So good question. So the table value is a 2 as a minimum table value. However, as it says at the bottom, all values may be adjusted by plus or minus 1. So no issue with going down to a 1 for a par 4, par 5 hole. For example, let's say that there's just a handful of very small trees. They're only, you know, 5-6 feet tall. They just planted them. That's the only trees in the hole. It'd be kind of silly to give that a 2. The reason the table starts at 2 is that in the old system, before we changed this to this new table, it was really easy to get a 1. And we had rating teams giving 1s to holes that look similar to that example I just showed. So a hole like this, where there's trees down the entire hole, there were rating teams giving it a 1. I think I'll go back here, right there. So we want to make it so that if trees are a minor problem, which is more than a 0 problem, a 2 is a good starting point. You know, again, you can go down to a 1 if it's just, you know, if there was just 1 or 2 trees in this entire hole, a 1 would be appropriate. But once there's a tree-lined hole, once there's trees down, you know, one side or both sides for sure, a 2 is pretty much your starting point at that, you know, with that level. So.
Great. I've got 2 more, should be relatively quick ones here. In the last example, did we make an adjustment for the bogey golfer, even though the weighting is greater for the bogey golfer?
No, it's not an adjustment. So if you're talking about the example that's on the screen now, that was just straight from the table. So the table, you know, for a 2 or more shot hole, it's a 4 if it's moderate. It's a 6 if it's significant. So, you know, I just put in moderate / significant to mean it was a tweener between those two. So the 5 is really based on the table itself, not an adjustment. But again, the weighting will be higher for the bogey as well when the calculations are done for trees. So it's a combination of the table value or the obstacle value and the weighting.
Okay, and last one here. Could the same tree count under both green target and trees adjustment?
Yes, definitely. So and that's why I referenced back to green target. So under green target, there is also an obstruct adjustment, which really is dealing with trees itself. So it says if the approach to the green is obstructed by a tree in front of or overhanging the green. So this is only relative to a tree that's in front of the green though. So you couldn't have an obstruct adjustment for a green target on a tee shot to a landing zone where there's a tree obstructing it. But if there's a tree in front of the green, and I know that there's courses that's part of their, you know, the way that they laid out the hole, not only would it obstruct the ability to get to the green, you know, so it'd be an O adjustment +1 for green target, but you would also apply an additional O for the tree rating as well to give it, you know, that extra point for obstruct for trees. So yeah, it's not really double dipping because it's actually affecting 2 different obstacles. It's affecting the player's ability to deal with the trees, but also to reach the green or to hit the green. All right, is that it, John?
Yep, that's all for now.
Okay, we'll move forward here. These last 2 obstacles don't take very long, so we should be finishing up here prior to our 3:30 end time that we had indicated. Green surface is the evaluation of the difficulty of chipping and putting on each hole. We look at the 2 things really factor into green surface ratings. One is the green speed as measured by the Stimpmeter, and we're not going to go into how to use the Stimpmeter in this particular session. Obviously, somebody who's a newer rater or brand new is going to be able to see how the team leader or the experienced raters on the team would use the Stimpmeter on the golf course. And then we also look at green surface contouring and slope or tilt, and those are 2 different concepts. So there's contouring and then there's slope or tilt, and I'm going to explain a little bit about the difference between them here in a second. Here's our table for green surface rating. As you can see on the left, that's based on the green speed. So the column on the left is based on what is the Stimpmeter reading that the team has determined for that particular course. When I say course, we do stimp multiple greens on a course typically to make sure that they're consistent, but there's absolutely no reason to stimp every single green on a course during a rating. The original purpose of a Stimpmeter was actually to get green speeds to be consistent, and in this day and age, it's pretty rare to find a golf course where the green speed changes from hole to hole. So once you've established a green speed on, let's say you got through hole 2 or 3 and you've done it a couple times, just use that same row, that same speed for the entire course. And then on the right side of the table, where those 3 categories are relatively flat, moderately contoured, or highly contoured. And those again are based on the contouring of the green. And then underneath it says, or gently sloped, or moderately contoured, or steeply sloped, moderately sloped or steeply sloped. That's based on the what you would call like the pitch of the green or the tilt of the green. So a green can actually be flat in terms of having no real contour, but it's pitched at an angle where the ball rolls significantly farther down the slope as it does up the slope. So that's where that moderately sloped or steeply sloped can come into play. And if you look at the bottom of the table where it talks about the amount of roll downhill for each foot of roll uphill, a green that is fairly flat and rolls less than 2 feet downhill for every foot it rolls uphill would be considered gently sloped. It's the equivalent of a relatively flat green. Once you get to be at least a 2 foot downhill for every foot uphill on the roll, it gets into the moderately sloped category. Again, regardless of whether it's contoured or not, it could be, again, a flat green that's just tilted at an angle that causes those putts to really be difficult. And all the way up to 3 to 1. If it gets over 3 to 1, so if it rolls 3 times as far down the slope as it does up the slope, we're into a steeply sloped category. So again, there's 2 different ways to use each of the columns. As you'll notice here in the table, there's some numbers that are in brackets or parentheses. Those are bogey values. So once you get to either a fairly fast moderate or a medium or fast highly contoured green, you're going to get an extra point for the bogey. So once you get to essentially a 7 or greater, you're going to get an extra point for bogey other than when it's a flat green. So if it's moderate or highly contoured or steeply sloped, once you get to 8.6 or above, or 10 foot or above for the moderate, you're going to get an extra point for the bogey golfer. Okay, moving forward here with some examples. Oops, went too far. So we have a relatively flat green, and as it says, relatively does not mean tabletop. Greens are expected to have a little bit of movement to them. So as you can see in this image, there's a little bit of a ridge kind of on the right side of the green, kind of in front of those 2 bunkers there to the back right. Not enough to call this anything above a relatively flat green. So again, it doesn't have to be tabletop flat, but it could have a little bit of movement and still be considered relatively flat. One thing about green surface ratings and honestly about trees as well is that you don't want to look at the course in a bubble. You don't want to say that. I've heard it happen many times where a rating team says, well, this is the worst green on the golf course. Let's give this one a moderate, or let's give this one a highly contoured. It's not about comparing it just to the greens or like I said, the trees on that particular course. It's about how they compare to the rest of the courses around the country and around the world. So a course may have all relatively flat greens. Just because there's 1 or 2 of them that are a little bit worse than the others doesn't mean you have to jump into the moderate category. Again, it's based on comparing it to all greens that are out there across the world. Moderately contoured, as you can see here, this one has quite a bit of movement. Looks like there's a kind of a sloped part of the green to the left, and then to the right there's a couple little ridges. The players definitely have to deal with the ball breaking one way or the other, or going uphill a little bit slower than going downhill, but enough to definitely call it a moderately contoured green. And then a highly contoured green is usually one that has multiple ridges, where a player might have a putt that breaks multiple directions on the same putt. So a long putt from the front of the screen might break 2 or 3 times before it actually gets to that hole location where it is today. So a single ridge kind of through the middle of the green is probably more of a moderate contour. Could be highly contoured depending on how steep it is. But once you have multiple ridges like this one, now you're getting into the highly contoured category. And another thing with green surface ratings, and this applies to other obstacles as well, but specifically with green surface ratings, We have a concept we call toggling, which is defined in the system actually, where it's not uncommon for a rating team to come to a green and not agree whether it's one category or the other. So you may have half the team saying this is moderate, the other half says it's highly contoured, and you can't really agree upon it. That's not a problem actually. What we do then is we go with one or the other, and then the next time you have that same exact argument, we go the opposite direction. So if you had multiple greens in a row where the rating team was kind of unsure which category it's in, just make sure you just kind of alternate. You go up on one, you go down on another. So there are a lot of greens that tend to fall into that category, which is in between the two. So using that toggling concept really just kind of averages it out. And then a tiered green, this would be a green that has at least a 2 foot or greater elevation difference between the two tiers. So as you can see here in the image, we have a lower tier to the left and we have an upper tier to the right. If there's at least a 2 foot or greater drop between the levels, we're going to call that a tiered green. And then the bogey golfer is going to get an additional point for a green surface. This is also going to filter into green target. The green target rate is going to be higher as well. But for green surface, it's only a bogey adjustment. So we're going to do a quick example for green surface. So this is a green that isn't contoured so much, but it's definitely tilted. The green tilts from back to front, so the ball will roll significantly farther down the slope than it will up the slope. So giving you some details about this green, the Stimpmeter reading is 9 feet if the green is flat. And that's one thing to keep in note, is that you wouldn't want to use a green like this to determine your Stimpmeter reading. You want to find a flat green or a flat surface of a green to get that Stimpmeter reading. So let's say that the green speed is 9 feet, based on a flat surface. This particular green, the ball rolls downhill 15 feet and only rolls uphill 7 feet on that same line of play for a majority of the green. Again, it's not looking at the worst part of the green or the flattest part of the green. It's looking at kind of the overall green as a majority. So when we look at that, that means it's greater than 2 to 1. So it's more than a 2 to 1 ratio of the ball rolling downhill versus uphill. That's going to put it into that moderately sloped category right there in the middle of the table. So 2 to 1 to 3 to 1 on the roll, downhill to uphill, and the green speed, like I mentioned, is 9 feet. So we're going to use the 8'6" to 9'11" row, and that's going to give us a 6 off the table. And that's going to apply to both scratch and bogey. So the only time bogey gets a different green surface rating is when there's either a parentheses value behind it, or if there's a tiered green, the bogey golfer will get an extra point. But if it's just a single value in the table and there's no tiered green, it's just going to be the same value for scratch and bogey. All right, any questions, John, pop up on green surface?
One question here. If they're not rating during the mid-season, would they need to just rely on the staff for the green speed?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because what you see the day that the rating is being done is not necessarily what's normal. So not only you could be in the mid-season, but maybe there's just been a lot of rain the last day or two, and they just haven't had a chance to mow it. So really, it's the combination of talking to the staff, talking to the maintenance staff about what they like to keep the greens at, but also just based on some general knowledge of the golf course, maybe hopefully a rating team member or two have played there before, kind of know whether that's normal or not. But we always say that it's better to talk to the maintenance staff than to talk to the pro shop staff. The pro shop staff often doesn't know exactly what's being done on the golf course and tends to inflate some of the numbers. They tend to think the greens are a lot faster than they are. The maintenance staff's job is to keep those greens consistent. So they're going to probably give you a little bit more realistic number in most cases. So.
Great. And just one other question here, going back to the shoot adjustment from the last section.
Yep.
Does the shoot adjustment only apply to tee shots?
So the shoot adjustment is just applied to tee shots, yes. So it can only happen once on a hole, and then beyond that, we would just use an obstruct adjustment. The reason for that is that the tee shot is the only shot where we know the player's hitting the ball from. Once you get off the tee, the player's ball can be anywhere on that hole. It can be to the left, it can be to the right, it can be long, it can be short. So it's really hard to say that a shoot applies on a second or third shot when we don't know exactly where that shot is going to be hit from. So the tee shot's the only place where we kind of have a firm spot where we know the player is going to hit from. So. Okay, so let's move on. And again, one more obstacle here, and really it's something that a rating team really doesn't even have to think about doing when they're on the golf course, because this can be done through the software, or it could, if done by hand, it can be done after the rating's completely over. So with psychological, we're looking at the evaluation of the cumulative effect of other obstacles on a player's score. So psychological actually factors in the other 9 obstacles that have been rated. The location of many punitive obstacles close to a target area creates uneasiness, etc. It's essentially saying if we have a lot of high ratings for the other obstacles, we're going to get a high psychological rating as well. So what we do is we look at rating values of 5 or greater, and if there's at least 3 obstacles rated at 5 or greater, which total at least 20 points, we're going to have a psychological value. The more obstacles that are 5 or greater, and the higher that total is going to increase the psychological rating. So here's our table, and as it shows, you have to have a minimum of 3 obstacles, 5 or greater, that add up to be 20 or more to get a table value. But as those numbers increase, 5, 6, 7 obstacles at 5 or greater, and the totals become much higher, 40, 45, 50, you can get a psychological rating in the 7, 8, 9 range. So it's an objective way to rate psychological. And like I said, this is done by the course rating software, so there's really no reason for a rater to know or to do this themselves when they're on the golf course, because it's going to be done automatically when they're done. So just to give you a quick example of psychological, so I've condensed a form 1 there on the bottom left, just to the final numbers, so you can see topography 2, 3, fairway 4, 5, etc. So we would look at the values of 5 or greater. So for the scratch golfer, we have a 5 for green target, 5 for crossing, 6 for lateral, and 6 for green surface. And for bogey, 5 for fairway, 7 green target, 6 R&R, 7 crossing, 5 lateral, and 6 green surface. So we have 4 obstacles adding up to 22 for scratch, and 6 obstacles adding up to 36 for bogey. We go to our table, and it winds up being a 3 for scratch and a 5 for bogey as a psychological rating. So like I said, this can all be done either at the end of the rating or just let the software do it, because there's really no reason for a rater to do this on the holes as they go. There are 2 adjustments under psychological, and again, these are automatically calculated by the software. So even though they're adjustments, they're automated. One of them is an extreme adjustment, which any obstacle that's been rated a 10, and a 10 meaning that's the maximum value for that particular obstacle, the minimum psychological rating is either a 5 or a 9. If it's one obstacle rated at 10 or greater, 10, it's a minimum psych of 5. If it's 2 or more obstacles rated at 10, it's a minimum psychological rating of 9. So, and then the last one is an extraordinary, and this applies only to bogey woman golfer or bogey woman player, is that when she has a crossing or lateral rating of 5 or greater, there are some minimum psychological ratings attached to that. So it doesn't matter what the table value is. These are the minimums, meaning if the table value is 3, but the crossing or lateral rating is 6, then that psychological becomes a 6. And it's not cumulative. It doesn't add the table value to this minimum. This just means that it's the minimum value that can be given on that hole. Okay, questions on psychological, John?
No questions on that side.
Good. I wouldn't expect that. So, okay. So I know we're right at the 3:30 Eastern time ending point. So were there any other questions that we didn't get to, John, that we can quickly answer here? Or?
It looks like we've been able to get to most of them. So of course, we will follow up with a Q&A document in the coming days, distributed via email. But outside of that, that seems to be all. So again, thank you all for joining us, not only today, but for this entire series of webinars over the past couple of weeks. For assistance in accessing the recording of today's session, if you weren't able to catch the entire thing, please contact your Allied Golf Association. They will certainly be able to assist you with that. And we are looking to add some upcoming webinars in the future. Any information on that will be distributed through your Allied Golf Association as well. Scott, if you have anything else to add, I believe that just about covers it here.
No, and thanks everybody for sticking around, and especially those who attended all 3 sessions. So we know it took quite a while to get through these 3 sessions, but hopefully it was helpful. Matt, do you have anything to add? All right then. Well, we'll let everybody go, and again, hopefully we'll speak in the future, or maybe in person at some point when we're able to travel again. So have a good day, and we'll talk to everybody later.